Black ethnography is not about the other. It is a persistent easing into the ubiquity of blackness. An essence, yes, an essence that is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Blackness settles into the thrust of the neck or a sway of the hips, the skipping beats of a shattered heart, or in the inflection of a tongue, and in the brilliance of a black mind scattered with a million stars. Blackness is 2,000 seasons that pass in a blink of an eye. It is a commitment to the impossible idea of our wholeness. It appears and disappears, wild, uncontrollable, and unplaceable, but still it's articulated with and through the logics of place. Zora Neale Hurston wrote the first post-colonial ethnography, and blackness in the Caribbean was her first preoccupation. Writing about Pocomania and the land where the rooster lays an egg, some translated it her as a little crazy, but Brother Levi says it means something out of nothing. It is important to a great number of people in Jamaica, so perhaps we ought to peep in on it a while. Black ethnography studies the ways that blackness moves, the way it speaks, the way it articulates itself, and reimagines the world to make itself belong for a fleeting moment in the break. Blackness is not an object or a thing. It is a way of being reflecting back upon itself, a fearless embrace of that which is nameless, formless, unseen yet present nonetheless. It is a movement into the ecstasy of alterity. It is a homecoming into blackness of twilight, into the sound of Nina Simone's voice, into that sweet smell of musk floating from between your mother's thighs. Not a singular self, a historical self, or a transcendent self, but rather it is becoming into an imaginative life world that we have shut ourselves off to. The incarcerated child, the decrepit body, the lonely crone, the nappy-headed boy in the back of class, called by somebody else's name. Her curiosity nonetheless. To mother, male, female, both, neither, it doesn't matter, is a verb, not a noun. It is not confined to the possession of a vagina. It refers to the capacity to carry a womb. Womb, a black, unseen place that generously offers up itself to the body, mind, and spirit of unborn ghosts. The womb gives life to that which is absent yet present nonetheless. It makes something out of everything. The womb, the blackest mother, is the birthplace of the history of ideas. The black ethnographic storyteller is an unrealized mother in the making. She is seeking her own completion by giving narrative over to blackness. Of protest and resistance. The naming of the black academic as speaking flesh produces knowledge in the life world of the brokenness of the blackened intellectual culture worker. She speaks and writes as flesh that is crossed by the stigmata of enslavement, a forced psychic transmutation of the black body into flesh. Against all odds, the black intellectual manages to overcome an officially imposed silence that ironically was drilled into her by her own assimilation into the political culture of the professional discourser, and which has made her into a rather socially and psychologically tormented personage produced by the state and corporate-sponsored miseducation regimes for the service into which we now call the neoliberal university. Moving into interior intersubjectivity signals black female vestibularity, that is, her becoming the speaking flesh, both because and despite of its doubling, that is, her psychic transmutation from a false subject who rather violently suppresses the rich complexity of her inner life world in order to become what Spillers describes as the marked woman, who's always misnamed through stereotypes and controlling images into what Spillers describes as a kind of different kind of social subject, who gains the insurgent ground by claiming the monstrosity that might allow her to rewrite a radically different text for female empowerment. For Spillers, such intersubjective interiority provides a pathway away from the isolation of the professional discurser and toward a contemplative multiverse in which the black female sings with ancestors, writes with spirits, and dances with ghosts both in this world and foreign to it. Word, image, rhythm, sound, color, emotion, corporeal orature, that verse, that melody, that buzz, represents the strength value of the inner drive that strives against the grain of the normative and colonial, and often both expresses and constitute itself through the poetic imagination, which is capable of saying both self and world at the same time. Can we allow that resides in each of us to guide our commentary on epistemology, phenomenology, ontology, and even ethnography? Can this drive toward life inform our teaching, our writing, our embodied interpretation of Black life on the page? Can scholars of Black political life be Black too? The Black feminist scholar dares to approach the exuberance of our presence with a full-throated laugh in the most miserable of circumstances. We matter because Blackness is the soul of the world. We dare to be who we are. We live. In Black ethnography lives the interface between the ontologies and epistemologies of human life, the science of living and knowing life, and knowing and writing the episteme of Blackness which refuses exception. Everybody knows this and everybody says it. I mean, you can see and hear it every which way you turn, but only if you know how to listen. Only the genuinely stupid denies it. The only folks who have a hard time acknowledging this truth is the voluntarily self-deluded academic who confines Blackness to one middle passage, ignoring alternative historical pathways to the lived experience of the Black self. The best of us know, but when we do, we say it within linguistic paradigms that are foreign to Blackness. We speak life in other people's vocabularies to legitimate our roles as professional discursors. Knowledge of the Black self is a jewel that is meant only for the worthy. Sandra Harding's contention that gender oppression is structured along three main dimensions, the institutional, the symbolic, and the individual, offers a useful model for a more comprehensive analysis encompassing race, class, and gender oppression. Systemic relationships of domination and subordination structured through social institutions such as schools, businesses, hospitals, the workplace, and government agencies represent the institutional dimension of oppression. Racism, sexism, and elitism all have concrete institutional locations. Even though the workings of the institutional dimension of oppression are often obscured with ideologies claiming equality of opportunity, in actuality, race, class, and gender place Asian American women, Native American men, white men, African American women, and other groups in distinct institutional niches with varying degrees of penalty and privilege. Futile theoretical struggles concerned with ranking oppressions and towards analysis that assume race, class, and gender are all present in any given setting, even if one appears more visible and salient than the others. Our task becomes redefined as one of reconceptualizing oppression by uncovering the connections among race, class, and gender as categories of analysis. Sandra Harding's contention that gender oppression is structured along three main dimensions, the institutional, the symbolic, and the individual, offers a useful model for a more comprehensive analysis encompassing race, class, and gender oppression. Systemic relationships of domination and subordination structured through social institutions such as schools, businesses, hospitals, the workplace, and government agencies represent the institutional dimension of oppression. Racism, sexism, and elitism all have concrete institutional locations. Even though the workings of the institutional dimension of oppression are often obscured with ideologies claiming equality of opportunity, in actuality, race, class, and gender place Asian American women, Native American men, white men, African American women, and other groups in distinct institutional niches with varying degrees of penalty and privilege. My interest in Black feminist love politics departs from interpretations of love as simply a practice of self valuation. Instead, I analyze second wave Black feminism's plea for love as a significant call for ordering the self and transcending the self, as a strategy for remaking the self and for moving beyond the limitations of selfhood. Moreover, this paper reads Black feminists love politics' insistence on transcending the self and producing new forms of political communities as a kind of affective politics. My use of the term affective politics draws on works by scholars such as Sarah Ahmed, Loan Berlin, Juan Munoz, and Cvetovic, who invite us to ask, how do emotions work to align some subjects with some others and against others? How do emotions move between bodies? I use the term affective politics to describe how bodies are organized around intensities, longings, desires, temporalities, repulsions, curiosities, fatigues, optimism, and how these effects produce political moments or sometimes inertias. I'm particularly interested in reading Black feminism's affective love politics as a departure from the kind of political work that Black feminism is often associated with, identity politics. Skeptical theoretical milieu, feminists regularly craft narratives about feminist history that relegate Black feminism to the past, precisely because of its imagined attachment to identity work, an attachment that has been vilified by feminists of many different persuasions. My investment in tracing Black feminism's non-identitarian work is animated by a commitment to underscoring the myriad political traditions that have long been part of Black feminism, but that are often ignored because of the extent of intersectionality's institutionalization. I am interested in heeding Munoz's call to imagine a position or narrative of being and becoming that can resist the pull of identitarian models of relationship and relationality, and in foregrounding the Black feminist work that imagines relationality outside of the illusions of identity politics. I'm not suggesting that intersectional labor is inherently opposed to affective work, particularly in a moment in which intersectionality is practiced across the humanities and social sciences and is inflected differently by each intersectionality practitioner. Instead, I am undergirded by the belief that the task of tracing Black feminism's multiple and heterogeneous political traditions is of the utmost importance in a moment in which Black feminist labor is increasingly reduced to the status of a relic because of its affiliation with intersectionality's identitarian work. What do I mean when I describe intersectionality as an identitarian project? I argue that intersectionality is inextricably linked to the production and maintenance of identity categories. Its primary intervention, I argue, is to add complexity to existing identity categories, not to jettison categories altogether. and reconceptualized by a notion of assemblage. Following Masumi on the retrospective ordering of identities such as gender, race, and sexual orientation, which backform their reality, in Terrace Assemblages, she writes, intersectional identities and assemblages must remain as interlocutors in tension. Intersectional identities are the byproducts of attempts to still and quell the perpetual motion of assemblages, to capture and reduce them to harness their threatening mobility. Puar, 2017, page 213. Subject positioning on a grid is never self-coinciding. Positioning does not perceive movement, but rather is induced by it. Epistemological correctives cannot comprehend ontological becomings. The complexity of process is continually mistaken for a resultant product. Part of the assumption at work in these queries is that representation and its recognized subjects is the dominant, primary, and most efficacious platform of political interventions, while a Deleuzian non-representational, non-subject-oriented politics is deemed impossible. Perhaps these queries also reveal concerns about how they might be somehow incompatible or even oppositional, despite the fact that intersectionality and assemblage are not analogous in terms of content, utility, or deployment. As analytics, they may not be reconcilable, yet they need not be oppositional, but I argue rather frictional. I offer some preliminary thoughts on the limits and possibilities of intersectionality in this image and what might be gained by thinking them through and with each other. What are the strengths of each in the realms of theory, political organizing, legal structures, and method? Though through highlighting the convivial crossings of these two differentiated but not oppositional genealogies, I offer some thoughts on epistemological corrections in feminist knowledge production, which has been driven sometimes single-mindedly by the mandate of intersectional analysis to see what kinds of futures are possible for feminist theorizing. I reread the formative concept that fueled the metaphoric invocation of intersectionality, specifically Kimberly Kenshaw's use of the traffic intersection to show her intersectionality as that which retroactively forms the grid and positions on it, and assemblage as that which is prior to, beyond, or past the grid. Not so much intersect, though, through, and I am tempted to make a pun, but rather resonate with each other. That is to say, what follows aspires to an affirmative, convivial conversation between what we have generally been construed as oppositional sets of literature, that of women of color intersectional feminist theory, and feminist theory that has been invested in post-representational, post-human, or post-subject conceptualizations of the body. My aim here, says Jasbura, then, is not to evaluate the limits and potentials of intersectionality for the sake of refining intersectionality itself, nor to weigh in on the debates about whether intersectionality is outmoded and outdated, but to put intersectionality in tandem with assemblage to see how they might be thought through together. While Crenshaw specifically charted the allegiance of both critical race paradigms and gender normative paradigms, intersectionality emerged from the struggles of second-wave feminism as a crucial black feminist intervention, challenging the hegemonic rubrics of race, class, and gender within predominantly white feminist frames. Pedagogically, since the emergence and consolidation of intersectionality from the 1980s on, it has been deployed more forcefully as a feminist intervention to disrupt whiteness and less so as a critical race intervention to disrupt masculinist frames. Thus, precisely in the act of performing this intervention, what is also produced is an ironic reification of sexual difference as the foundational one that needs to be disrupted. Sexual and gender difference is understood as the constant from which there are variants, just as women of color are constructed in dominant feminist generational narratives as the newest arrivals among the subjects of feminism. This pedagogical deployment has the effect of resecuring the centrality of the subject positioning of white women. Versive or articulating a grievance. More poignantly, it is the difference of African American women that dominates this genealogy of the term women of color. Indeed, Crenshaw is clear that she centralizes black women's experiences and posits black women as the starting point of her analysis. Crenshaw, 1991, page 1243. Thus, the insistent consolidation of intersectionality as a dominant heuristic may well be driven by anxieties about maintaining the integrity of discrete black feminist genealogy, one that might actually obfuscate how intersectionally is thought of and functions differently in different strands of black feminist and women of color feminist thought. Assemblage is actually an awkward translation of the French term agencement. The original term in Deleuze and Guattari's work is not the French word assemblage, but agencement, a term that means design, layout, organization, arrangement, and relations. The focus being not on content but on relations of patterns. Phillips 2006, page 108. And agencement, as John Phillips explains, specific connections with other concepts is precisely what gives them their meaning. Concepts do not prescribe relations, nor do they exist prior to them. Rather, relations of force, connection, resonance, and patterning give rise to concepts. As Phillips writes, the priority is neither to the state of affairs, what one might call essence, nor the statement, enunciation, or expression of that essence, but rather of their connection, which implies the production of a sense that exceeds them and of which, transformed, they now form parts. The French and English definitions of assemblage, however, both refer to a collection of things, a combination of items, and the fact of assembling. The problematic that haunts this traversal from French theoretical production to U.S. academic usage is about the generative effects of this mistranslation. Phillips argues that the enunciation of agencement as assemblage might be justified as a further event of agencement, assemblage, were it not for the tendency of discourses of knowledge to operate as statements about states of affairs. One productive way of approaching this continental impasse would be to ask not necessarily what assemblages are, but rather what do assemblages do? What does assemblage do as a conceptual frame? And what does their theoretical deployment as such do? What is a practice of agencement? For current purposes, assemblages are interesting because they deprivilege the human body as a discrete organic thing. As Donna Haraway notes, the body does not end at the skin. We leave traces of our DNA everywhere we go. We live with other bodies within us, microbes, bacteria. We are enmeshed in forces, affects, energies. We are composites of information. Assemblages do not privilege bodies as human, nor as residing within a human, animal, non-human, animal binary. Along with de-exceptionalizing of human bodies, multiple forms of matter can be bodies, bodies of water, cities, institutions, and so on. Matter is an actor. Following Karen Barad on her theory of performative metaphysics, matter is not a thing, but a doing. In particular, Barad challenges dominant notions of performativity that operate through an implicit distinction between signification and that which is signified, stating that matter does not materialize through signification alone. A performative understanding of discursive practices challenges the representationalist belief in the power of words to represent pre-existing things. Performativity, properly construed, is not an invitation to turn everything, including material bodies, into words. On the contrary, performativity is precisely a contestation of the excessive power granted to language to determine what is real. Hence, in ironic contrast to the monism that takes language to be the stuff of reality, performativity is actually a contestation of the unexamined habits of the mind that grant language and other forms of representation more power in determining our ontologies than they deserve. Karen Barad, 2003, page 802. Take the notion of class or the class struggle. It implies that there are perfectly delimited sociological objects, bourgeoisie, proletariat, aristocracy, but these entities become hazy in the many interzones, the intersections of the petit bourgeois, the aristocratic bourgeois, and the aristocracy of the proletariat, the lumpenproletariat, and the non-guaranteed elite, that result in indeterminacy that prevents the social field from being mapped out in a clear and distinct way, and which undermines militant practice. Now, the notion of arrangement can be useful here because it shows that social entities are not made up of bipolar oppositions. Complex arrangements place parameters like race, sex, age, nationality, etc. into relief. Interactive crossings imply other kinds of logic than that of two by two class oppositions. Importing this notion of arrangement into the social field isn't just a gratuitous theoretical subtlety, but it might help to configure the situation to come up with cartographies capable of identifying and eluding certain simplistic conceptions concerning class struggle. Guattari, 2009, page 26. 3. Control as an effect of disciplinary apparatuses, control as the epitome of disciplinary society par excellence, in that disciplinary forms of power exceed their sites to reproduce everywhere. And finally, as Foucault suggests above, disciplinary frames as a form of control as a response to the proliferation of control. Therefore, to dismiss assemblages in favor of retaining intersectional identitarian frameworks is to dismiss how societies of control tweak and modulate bodies as matter, not predominantly through signification or identity interpolations, but rather through affective capacities and tendencies. It is also to miss that assemblages encompass not only ongoing attempts to destabilize identities and grids, but also forces that continue to mandate and enforce them. That is to say, grid making is a recognized process of agencement. But to render intersectionality as an archaic relic of identity politics bypasses entirely the possibility that for some bodies, we can call them statistical outliers, or those consigned to premature birth, or those once formerly considered less useless bodies or bodies of excess. Discipline and punish may well still be a primary apparatus of power. There are different conceptual problems posed by each. Intersectionality attempts to comprehend political institutions and their attendant forms of social normativity and disciplinary administration, while assemblages, in an effort to reintroduce politics into the political, ask what is prior to and beyond what gets established. So, one of the big payoffs for thinking through the intertwined relations of intersectionality and assemblage is that it can help us produce more roadmaps of precisely these not quite fully understood relations between discipline and control.